Welcome to episode number 4 in our Psychology of a Killer series. In yesterday's episode, we talked about how a serial killer goes about doing what they do. It was really interesting to dive into how they pick their victims and how they go about committing these crimes. So if you have not yet, make sure to go ahead and check out yesterday's episode. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about the specific case of a serial killer. The reason I want to dive into specific serial killers is because it can be interesting to look into their backgrounds and make connections between their warning signs and their experiences versus the crimes that they will go on to commit. The killer that we are going to be discussing today is honestly so demented and disturbing, and it does involve children, so if that's something that you're sensitive to, then this video is not for you. In this video, we are going to be going over the background and history of this prolific killer, as well as the crimes that he went on to commit. Today, we are going to be talking about the heinous crimes of Albert Fish. Albert Fish was originally born with the name Hamilton Fish on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. to parents Randall and Ellen Fish. He was the youngest of 4 siblings. He had an older sister named Annie and 2 older brothers named Walter and Edwin. Albert's father was actually 75 years old when he was born, and his mother was 43 years younger than his father. Albert's father, Randall, worked as a riverboat captain and later a fertilizer manufacturer. But on October 16, 1875, he actually passed away of a heart attack. At the time, Albert was only 5 years old. After Randall died, Albert's mother put him in St. Joseph's Orphanage in Washington, which I will get into in just a minute. So Albert's family did have a history of mental illness. Now, we have to remember that this was the 1800s, so the way they diagnosed mental health issues was vastly different than how they do it today. Albert's uncle was diagnosed with mania, which is basically just being in a constant state of abnormally elevated arousal, affect, and energy level. Albert's brother was sent off to stay in a mental hospital, and his sister was diagnosed with a mental affliction, which isn't super specific, but again, the way they diagnosed these things back then are way different than how they do it now. His mother was diagnosed with auditory and or visual hallucinations, and 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses as well. So from the time that Albert was born, the cards were kind of already stacking against him. As we know, those with extensive family histories of mental illness have a much higher likelihood of developing one themselves. Now, after Albert's father died, like I said, his mother placed him into an orphanage because she just couldn't raise him properly and just didn't have the money, but he had an extremely tough time at the orphanage. He was often viciously abused and whipped. His teachers would strip him and other boys down and would beat them in front of the other boys and girls in the orphanage. He once said that he often saw boys doing many things that they should not have been doing. The crazy thing was that he was beaten so often for so many years that he actually began to enjoy the beatings that he was suffering. It was also during his time in the orphanage that he started going by the name Albert instead of Hamilton, because other boys at the orphanage would bully him and call him the name Ham and Eggs. By the time 1880 rolled around, Albert's mother had finally gotten a job and was able to remove her son from the orphanage when he was 9 years old. By the time Albert was 12 in 1882, he had started his first relationship with a telegraph boy. And this telegraph boy was not good news. He actually started introducing Albert to things such as eating feces and drinking urine. The two would go to public baths on the weekend where they would watch other boys undress and bathe. By 1890, Albert, who was now a young man, moved to New York City where he became a male prostitute. This is also when he began sexually assaulting young boys. Now, fast forwarding a little bit to 1898, Albert actually got married to a woman that his mother had arranged for him. She was 9 years younger than him, and the two actually had 6 children together named Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry. He did work as a house painter at this time, so it kind of just seemed like they had the average life. However, even after he was married and was having children and was working a normal job, he continued sexually assaulting young boys, mostly under the age of 6, in New York City. It was in 1903 that Albert had his first real run-in with the law when he was sentenced to prison for embezzlement. And of course, while he was in prison, he did have sexual relationships with other men. I'm not exactly sure the exact time frame in which this happened, but at some point, Albert and another young man went to a wax museum where he began his fascination with castration. And this seemed to kind of be where some of his more disturbing fascinations started. At one point, Albert began a relationship with a mentally handicapped man who he tried to castrate after tying him up. This man ended up getting away, but this was not the last time that Albert would try to live out these sick fantasies. He also started visiting brothels where he would be willingly whipped and beaten. So pretty much since the time that he was little, he found pleasure in pain and suffering. In January of 1917, Albert's wife actually left him for a man named John Straub, who was a handyman who lived with the family. At this point, Albert was left to raise his 6 children on his own. Her leaving affected him pretty heavily, and this is when he reportedly began hearing voices. There was one incident where he wrapped himself up in a rug, claiming that he was following the orders of John the Apostle. However, despite this, Albert was reportedly a good and kind and loving father and eventually grandfather. Also throughout his life, Albert became obsessed with religion. He began having visions of Christ and his angels and hearing voices that he believed was God talking to him. He would start hearing things like, "Happy is he that taketh thy little ones, and dasheth their little heads against their stones." He saw himself as Abraham and the little ones as Isaac. In a direct quote from Albert, he says, "It seemed to me that I had to offer a child for sacrifice to purge myself of sins, iniquities, and abominations in the sight of God." It was in 1910, so just rewinding a little bit, when Albert committed his first attack on a child. This child was Thomas Bedden from Wilmington, Delaware. Then in 1919, he stabbed another young boy who was mentally handicapped in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. On July 1st, 1924, Albert spotted a little girl named Beatrice Keel playing in her parents' farm in Staten Island, New York. He asked her to help him come look for rhubarbs in some of the neighboring fields and even offered her money to come help him do so. However, as she followed him off the farm, thank God, her mother noticed and chased Albert away. Now, he did leave, but he eventually came back and tried sleeping there. But Beatrice's father actually caught him and made him leave. However, the next little girl that he set his sights on wouldn't be so lucky. Edward Budd was an able-bodied, energetic young man who was the oldest of a poor working-class family who was just scraping by in Manhattan, New York. On May 25th, 1928, Edward put out a classified ad in a Sunday edition of New York World newspaper that said, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." Albert saw this ad and he was intrigued. It was on May 28th, 1928, when 58-year-old Albert visited the Budd family at their home in Manhattan. He knocked on the door and introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, New York. He was a fragile old man with gentle eyes and a drooping mustache. When he was at the Budd home, he explained that he was looking to hire help for his truck farm in Long Island, New York. He looked Edward up and down and said that he liked what he was seeing and offered him a generous compensation and arranged to come back to the home a few days later so that he could pick him up and drive him to the farm. A few days later, on June 3rd, the kind, frail old man returned to the Budd home, but when he got there, Edward was actually out running errands. It was no problem though, as Edward's mother invited Albert into the home to have lunch as they waited for Edward to return. As he was sitting at the Budd family table, a glowing little girl, 10-year-old Grace, the youngest of the family, wandered into the dining room. Immediately, she caught Albert's eye. He called her over and sat her on his lap as he gushed over her beauty. He stroked her silky brown hair and told her that she reminded him of his own 10-year-old granddaughter. This is when he suddenly remembered that his niece was actually having a birthday party in Upper Manhattan that afternoon. He decided that he actually did want to go attend that party for a few hours and then come back and pick Edward up. He had the bright idea that maybe Grace would like to come with. It was going to be quite the party with lots of children, games, and ice cream. How could little Grace resist? Albert, or Frank Howard as they knew him, promised that he would take good care of her and return her home before dark. Delia Flanagan, Grace's mother, felt a little bit uncertain since this man was basically a stranger to them, but he just seemed completely harmless after all, and he had just offered their son a handsomely paying job, so How could this go wrong? Grace's father, Albert Budd, talked to Delia into letting her go, saying that it was no big deal and that she was going to have a lot of fun at this birthday party. Like I said, this family didn't have a lot of money, and this was a nice opportunity for Grace to be able to go out and have some fun. Grace was so excited and went and changed into her best outfit, and she walked away hand in hand with Albert Fish towards the subway station. However, after reaching the train station, Albert Fish had to stop to retrieve a canvas bundle that he had stashed behind the corner newsstand on his way to the Budds' home. Wrapped inside of this canvas bundle was a butcher's knife, a cleaver, and a saw. They went on to the train, and Grace never returned home. On September 5th, 1930, a 66-year-old man, Charles Edward Pope, was arrested as a suspect in Grace's kidnapping after being accused by his estranged wife. He spent a total of 108 days in jail from the time of his arrest to his trial on December 22nd, 1930. About 7 years after Grace's kidnapping, in November of 1934, an anonymous letter was delivered to Grace's mother at the Budd apartment. I will read some of the letter, but some of it is honestly just too disturbing for me to read, so I will have the letter up on the screen if you want to read the whole thing. So you can just go ahead and pause if you want to read the whole thing, or you can just Google it and it will show up in the results. Dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on a steamer Tacoma Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco for Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At the time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 per pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long that he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7 and one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times a day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. He told me so often how good human flesh was that I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all of my clothes off. If I did not, I would get her blood on them. When I was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and run down the stairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. Then, in the last part of the letter, he describes how he brutally assaults and kills her. And in the last part of the letter, which again, I'm not going to read word for word because it is just too disturbing to me, he says that he did not sexually assault her, but he did eat her. Again, you can pause the video if you wish to read it word for word. Now, after receiving this letter, Delia was actually illiterate, so she could not read the letter herself, so she had to have her son read it for her instead. Of course, it was absolutely disgusting and traumatizing. Now, I'll get more into this in a few minutes, but Albert actually later admitted that he did sexually assault Grace. He was a compulsive liar, though, so we don't really know what's true and what isn't. Now, when the letter was delivered to the home, it was delivered in an envelope that had a small hexagon emblem with the letters NYPCBA, which stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. A janitor for the company told police that he had taken some of that stationery home, but left it at his rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street when he moved out. The landlord at that rooming house said that Albert Fish had actually checked out that room a few days prior. She told them that Albert's son had sent him money and he asked her to hold his next check. The lead investigator on this case was William F. King. He went to this room and waited for Albert to return to the room. When Albert got to the room, the two spoke and he actually agreed to go to the headquarters for questioning. However, when they got to the street door, Albert actually lunged at King with a razor in each hand. Of course, King got the razors away from Albert and took him over to the police headquarters. When he was being questioned, he actually admitted what he did to Grace, and everyone was just completely shocked. What he did even stunned the most hardened detectives. This was also when he admitted that Grace was not his original target. His original plan was to lure Edward into the abandoned house in Westchester, overpower him, bind him with stout cords, and castrate him. He then just planned to leave Edward there to let him bleed out. However, of course, after he saw Grace, the entire plan changed and he made up the birthday story on the spot. This is when he took her to a place locally known as Wisteria Cottage. What he did to her is what we just went over in the letter, and I honestly don't want to go through that again. Now, after being caught, yet another one of Albert's victims came out. This was 8-year-old Billy Gaffney. Billy Gaffney was playing in the hallway outside of his family's apartment in Brooklyn with his friend Billy Beaton on February 11th, 1927. Both boys went missing. However, Billy Beaton was found on the roof of the apartment home. Billy Gaffney was nowhere to be found. When Billy Beaton was asked what happened to his friend, he said that the boogeyman took him. They initially named another suspect until a man named Joseph Meehan saw a photo of Albert in the newspaper and identified him as the old man that he saw on February 11th as he was trying to quiet down a little boy who was sitting with him on the trolley. The little boy wasn't wearing a jacket despite there being freezing cold temperatures outside, and he was crying as he was being dragged on and off the trolley. Police matched the description of this little boy to Billy Gaffney, but his body was actually never recovered. Billy's mother actually decided to visit Albert when he was in prison to get more details about her son's death, and this is what Albert said. I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There's a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the boy there, stripped him and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a dirty piece of rag that I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes. I threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took the trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked from there home. Next day, about 2 p.m., I took his tools, a good heavy cat o' nine tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, split these halves in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped him. I cut him in multiple places. I put him in sacks weighted with stones, tied the ends, and threw them into pools of slimy water that you will see along the road going to North Beach. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best. I made a stew. I put onions, carrots, turnip, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. I ate every last bit of the meat in about 4 days. Again, I did not read the entire thing because it is incredibly disturbing, but you can look up what he said in specific if you're interested. Basically, he just described how he ate Billy after killing him. Now, the trial for Albert Fish for the premeditated murder was set on March 11th, 1935 in White Plains, New York. The judge was Frederick P. Close. The prosecuting attorney was Chief Assistant District Attorney Albert F. Gallagher, and James Dempsey was Albert's defense attorney. The trial lasted for 10 days, and of course, Albert Fish pled insanity. He claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to kill children. Now, several psychiatrists testified about his sexual fetishes, including coprophilia, urophilia, pedophilia, and masochism. I hope I'm saying that word right. But they could not agree with whether these fetishes meant that he was insane or not. One of the psychiatrists that spent a lot of time with Albert was named Dr. Frederick Wortham, a senior psychiatrist at the Bellevue Hospital. He had actually been recruited by the defense to examine Albert. Albert took a liking to him, and he was actually really the first person that Albert actually opened himself up to. He basically told him of his entire life of abuse and the crimes that he committed. Dr. Wortham was a seasoned psychiatrist who worked his entire life with the criminally insane. However, he said that the things Albert told him were so disturbing and appalling that he considered Albert as the most wildly deranged human that he's ever encountered. Among the other things that he confessed to Dr. Wortham, he admitted that he enjoyed shoving sewing needles up into his crotch. Of course, no one really believed him at first, but they did do x-rays and confirmed that there were 27 sewing needles in his pelvic region. But anyways, during the trial, Dr. Wortham claimed that Albert Fish was criminally insane. Another person who took the witness chair was Mary Nicholas, who was actually Albert's 17-year-old daughter. She testified that he actually taught her and her siblings a game that involved child molestation. In the end, the jury found Albert Fish as sane and guilty, and he was sentenced to death. It was after being sentenced to death that he actually confessed to yet another murder. This was the murder of 8-year-old Francis McDonald on July 15, 1924. Francis was playing on the front porch at his home near Port Richmond, Staten Island, New York. Francis's mother had apparently saw an old man walking by, clenching and unclenching his fists. He walked past the house the first time without really saying anything and with no incident. However, later that day, he was seen again, but this time he was watching Francis and his friends play. And this is when Albert made his move. Francis's body was later found in the woods near where a neighbor had actually seen Francis and Albert going earlier that afternoon. Albert Fish arrived in prison in March of 1935 and was executed on the electric chair on January 16, 1936. He was announced dead after 3 minutes. Before being executed, Albert Fish reportedly said that the electrocution would be the supreme thrill of my life. Apparently, the execution also took a little bit longer than it should have due to the needles that were shoved up his crotch, which disturbed the flow of electricity. So that basically concludes the story of Albert Fish. The victims that we discussed are the known victims, but he is thought to be responsible for even more. These possible victims include 12-year-old Letta Abramowitz, 16-year-old Mary Ellen O'Connor, and 17-year-old Benjamin Collins. This case was honestly so disturbing to research, but it is interesting to look in the childhood of this demented, vicious killer. As we saw from before, he was beaten as a child. However, there are many children that are beaten, unfortunately, but not many actually grow to like it. It is interesting to wonder what exactly it was that made Albert Fish turn out the way that he did. Why did he for some reason develop this like for being beaten? It just doesn't make sense to me. Normally you'd think that people would become terrified and have PTSD from being beaten, but he enjoyed it for some reason. What made him want to eat children? What made him choose children in the first place? These are things that we just don't understand even after looking at his childhood. I just wish that we could get some sort of brain scans or some sort of testing, but unfortunately, that's just not possible since this took place so long ago. Anyways, that is all I have for today's